Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. In this video, we will read about two very inspiring personalities, Stephen Hawking and Firdaus Kanga. Both of them did not let their physical constraint come in their way of success. Stephen Hawking was born on 8 January 1942. He died on 14 March 2018. Firdaus Kanga was born in 1960. He lives in London. Stephen Hawking was a well-known theoretical physicist, cosmologist, astrophysicist and author. Firdaus Kanga is a writer and journalist. Stephen Hawking suffered from motor neuron disease at the age of 21, which left his whole body paralyzed, whereas Firdaus Kanga was born with brittle bone disease. They both are extraordinary, they both are inspiring. The chapter, A Visit to Cambridge, is an extract from Firdaus Kanga's book, Heaven on Wheel, in which he has described his experience while his travel in Britain. It is like seeing Britain through the eyes of Firdaus Kanga. Cambridge is a renowned university in England. This chapter is in the form of interview between Firdaus Kanga and Stephen Hawking. Now let's read this very inspiring chapter. Before you read, this story is about meeting between two extraordinary people. Both of them are disabled or differently able, as we now say. Stephen Hawking is one of the greatest scientists of our time. He suffers from a form of paralysis or motor neuron disease. Paralysis is a disease in which one loses ability to move or feel anything in that part of the body which has suffered paralysis. Due to paralysis, he is confined to a wheelchair and he can speak only by punching buttons in his computer, which speaks in a machine-like voice. So he doesn't have a voice of his own. He speaks through punching the button in the computer and then a machine-like voice comes. Firdaus Kanga is a writer, a journalist. That time when the chapter was done, he lived in Mumbai, and Kanga was born with brittle bones. Brittle bones is a disease in which bones are very brittle. That means they are very weak and tend to break easily. He has suffered it since his childhood. Like Hawking, Kanga also moves around in a wheelchair. The two great men exchange their thought on what it means to live in a wheelchair and how the so-called normal people react to disabled in this chapter. Let's see the chapter. Cambridge was my metaphor for England, and it was strange that when I left, it had become altogether something else because I had met Stephen Hawking there. Firdaus Kanga says that Cambridge was his metaphor for England. Metaphor is a figure of speech in which comparison between two things is done. By saying that Cambridge was his metaphor for England, Firdaus Kanga wants to say that Cambridge was like entire England for him. If he has visited Cambridge, it meant he had visited the whole England. This was his perception in the beginning, but he felt strange that when he left from Cambridge or from England, it has become something else for him because he had met Stephen Hawking there. He had met Stephen Hawking in Cambridge. It was on a walking tour through Cambridge that the guide mentioned Stephen Hawking, poor man who is quite disabled now, though he is a worthy successor to Isaac Newton, whose chair he has at the university. So while Firdaus Kanga was on a walking tour through Cambridge, his guide mentioned Stephen Hawking. He also said that he is quite disabled now, though he is a worthy successor. Worthy successor is someone who is good and deserves to be someone's successor. Successor is a person who takes the position of the person who has left. So Firdaus Kanga's guide said that he was a worthy successor of Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton is a well-known scientist whose chair he has at the university. Stephen Hawking sits in the chair of Isaac Newton. He is a worthy successor of Isaac Newton. And I started because I had quite forgotten that this most brilliant and completely paralyzed astrophysicist. Astrophysics is the branch of physics which deals with stars, planets, etc. And astrophysicist is the scholar of astrophysics. Now, Firdaus Kanga realized that he had completely forgotten about this brilliant and completely paralyzed astrophysicist, Mr. Stephen Hawking, who is also the author of A Brief History of Time, one of the biggest bestseller ever lived here. So Firdaus Kanga has almost forgotten that this brilliant person, Stephen Hawking, almost lived here, and then he realized that he must meet him. When the walking tour was done, I rushed to a phone booth and, almost tearing the cord so it could reach me outside, phoned Stephen Hawking's house. When the walking tour of Cambridge was done, Firdaus Kanga rushed to a phone booth and stretched the cord so that it can reach him outside the booth. He called Stephen Hawking's house. There was his assistant on the line, and I told him I had come in a wheelchair from India. Perhaps he thought I had propelled myself all the way to write about my travels in Britain. Propelled means dragged or pushed forward. The phone was answered by assistant of Stephen Hawking, and Mr. Kanga told him that he had come in wheelchair from India to England, and he thinks that perhaps the assistant thought that he had pushed himself all the way from India to England in wheelchair just to write about his travels in Britain. I had to see Professor Hawking. Even 10 minutes would do. Half an hour, he said, from 3:30 to 4. So Firdaus Kanga requested for a meeting. He said even 10 minutes would do, but he got a meeting for 30 minutes from 3:30 to 4. And suddenly, I felt weak all over. Growing up disabled, you get fed up with people asking you to be brave, as if you have a courage account on which you are too lazy to draw a check. The only thing that makes you stronger is seeing somebody like you achieving something huge. Then you know how much is possible and you reach out further than you ever thought you could. The thought of meeting Stephen Hawking suddenly made Firdaus Kanga nervous. He feels that growing up disabled, you are fed up, you are tired of people telling you to be brave, as if you have this courage account and you don't want to use it. You are too lazy to use your courage. The only thing that makes you stronger is seeing somebody who is like you and who has achieved something big, something great. And then you know what is possible for people like you and you strive to do it. I haven't been brave, said his disembodied computer voice. Disembodied means without a body. So when this question was put forward by Firdaus Kanga to Stephen Hawking about bravery, Stephen Hawking replied in his mechanical voice that he wasn't brave, he had no choice. Surely, I wanted to say, living creatively with the reality of his disintegrated body was a choice, but I kept quiet because I felt guilty every time I spoke to him, forcing him to respond. Disintegrated means confined to a smaller form. On the answer of Stephen Hawking, Firdaus Kanga wanted to reply that living with creativity in such and confined to such a small form, was it a choice? But Mr. Kanga kept quiet because he felt guilty every time he forced Mr. Hawking to respond, to speak. There he was, tapping at the little switch in his hand, trying to find the words on his computer with the only bit of moment left to him. So now Firdaus Kanga was in front of an inspiring person, Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking, who did not have his voice, the only way he could express was by tapping his little finger on the computer which was attached to his wheelchair. His long pale fingers, every so often his eyes would shut in frustrated exhaustion. So this is the only way he could talk, by tapping the buttons on his computer, and this was the only way he could talk. He often felt exhausted. His eyes were often shut in frustration. And sitting opposite him, I could feel his anguish. Anguish means anger and frustration. The mind buoyant with thoughts that came out in frozen phrases and sentences stiff as corpse. Buoyant means intensely active and vibrant. Corpses means dead body. His mind, Stephen Hawking's mind, it was completely active. It was filled with new thoughts, but it came out in a frozen dead sentences like a stiff dead body. A lot of people seem to think that disabled people are chronically unhappy, That means continuously unhappy, I said. I know that's not true myself. Are you often laughing inside? Then Firdaus Kanga asked this question that people often think that people who are disabled are always unhappy. Are you unhappy or do you often laugh inside on these kind of sentences? About 3 minutes later, he responded, I find it amusing when people patronize me. Amusing means interesting, and patronize is treating in a way that is apparently kind and helpful but making one feel inferior. So Stephen Hawking replies that he feels it makes him feel interesting and sometimes even not good when people consider him inferior to them. And do you find it annoying when someone like me comes and disturbs you in your work? Then Firdaus Kanga asked that is it annoying for you? Is it irritating for you when somebody like me comes to interview you and disturb in your work? The answer flashed yes. Then he smiled his one-way smile and I knew without being sentimental or silly that I was looking at one of the most beautiful men in the world. So maybe jokingly Stephen Hawking answered to this question yes. And then Firdaus Kanga looked at his face and his one-way smile without being emotional, without being sentimental. And at once Firdaus Kanga knew that he was looking at the most beautiful men in the world, the smile of the most beautiful men in the world. A first glimpse of him is shocking because he is like a still photograph, as if all those pictures of him in magazines and newspapers have turned three-dimensional. Mr. Kanga says that when somebody sees Mr. Hawking for the first time, he would be shocked because he is just like a still photograph, as if the pictures in magazines and newspaper of him have turned three-dimensional. Then you see the head twisted sideways into a lump. Lump means fall heavily and limply. He cannot support his head, so it is twisted sideways, falling heavily. The torso shrunk inside the pale blue shirt. Torso is the upper part of the body. The wasted legs. His upper part of body is also shrunk inside his shirt. His legs are wasted. You look at his eyes, which can speak still, and they are saying something huge and urgent. It is hard to tell what, but you are shaken because you have seen something you never thought could be seen. Mr. Hawking's mind is full of thought which can be seen in his eyes. His eyes looks like they want to speak something urgent, something deep, something huge, but it is difficult to say what do they want to speak. But you would be shaken from inside because you will think that you have seen something which you have never seen before in his eyes. Before you, like a lantern whose walls are worn so thin, you glimpse only the light inside in the incandescence of a man. Incandescence means inner glow of light. So in front of you, Mr. Hawking is like a lantern whose walls are so worn out that you can only see the light inside, which is glowing. The body, almost irrelevant, exists only like a case made of shadows. So the body of Mr. Hawking, it is irrelevant. So that I know believer in eternal souls know that this is what each of us is. Everything else is unnecessary. Eternal means existing forever. So Mr. Kanga says that by seeing Mr. Hawking, even me, a person who does not believe in eternal souls, will start believing, because this is what it is. The soul matters, body doesn't. And it is just an accessory. The body is just an accessory. That means it is not essential. What is essential, what is important is what lies within the body, and it is the beautiful soul which Mr. Hawkins have. What do you think is the best thing about being disabled? I had asked him earlier. I don't think there is anything good about being disabled. So Mr. Kanga asked him this question, that what do you think is the best thing about being disabled? And Mr. Hawking replied that there is nothing good about being disabled. I think I said, you do discover how much kindness there is in the world. Yes, he said. It was a disadvantage of his voice synthesizer that it could convey no inflection, no shades or tone, and I could not tell how enthusiastically he agreed with me. Inflection is the rise and fall of voice in speaking. So Mr. Kanga again asked him that the best thing about being disabled is that you can know how much kindness is there in the world, because people are generally kind with disabled people. And Mr. Hawking said yes in his synthesizer, which was a disadvantage because Mr. Kanga could not say with how much enthusiasm he has agreed with him. Every time I shifted in my chair or turned my wrist to watch the time, I wanted to make every one of our 30 minutes count. I felt a huge relief and exhilaration in the possibilities of my body. How little it mattered then that I would never walk or even stand. Mr. Kanga wanted to make even every minute count, the time he had spent with Mr. Hawking, and he was extremely happy after meeting Mr. Hawking because of the abilities his body can possess, and it does not matter even if he cannot stand, because his body was much more able. I told him how he had been an inspiration beyond cliché for me and surely for others. Did that thought help him? Cliché is a phrase or idea that is used so often that it loses its meaning. Mr. Kanga told Mr. Hawking that he had been an inspiration not only for him but several others. And then he asked, did that help him? No, he said, and I thought how foolish I was to ask. When your body is a claustrophobic room and the walls are growing narrower day by day, it doesn't do much good to know that there are people outside smiling with admiration to see you breathing still. Claustrophobic means very small and suffocating. Claustrophobia is a fear, an abnormal fear of being in a very enclosed or small place. Then Mr. Kanga realized that how stupid he has been. When your body is like a small room and which is becoming narrower day by day, it doesn't matter whether people outside are inspired by you or want you to see still alive. Is there any advice you can give disabled people, something that might help make life better? They should concentrate on what they are good at. I think things like the Disabled Olympics are a waste of time. So Mr. Kanga asked that, do you want to give any message to people who are disabled to make their life better? And Mr. Hawking said that they should do what they are good at rather than wasting their time at something that they can't do. As per Mr. Hawking, Disabled Olympics was a waste of time. I know what you mean. I remember the years I had spent trying to play a Spanish guitar considerably larger than I was, and how gleefully I had unstringed it one night. Gleefully means happily. Mr. Kanga knew what Mr. Hawkins mean because he had tried to learn Spanish guitar, which was much larger than his size, and he failed in learning the guitar, and he happily removed all the string one night from the guitar and didn't learn it further. The half hour was up. I think I've annoyed you enough. I was grinning. Thank you for... Stay. I waited. Have some tea. I can show you the garden. So when the time was over, Mr. Kanga wanted to take leave. He smiled and he said that I have annoyed you much. And Mr. Stephen told him to stay. And he offered him tea, and he also said that he would show him the garden. The garden was as big as park, but Stephen Hawking covered every inch, rumbling along in his motorized wheelchair. Rumbling means making deep sound due to movement of wheels. So the garden was very big, but Stephen Hawking covered every inch of it in his wheelchair. I dodged to keep out of way. Dodged means avoided. Mr. Kanga tried to keep out of way. We couldn't talk very much. The sun made him silent, the letters on his screen disappearing in the glare. Glare means in the light. So during the walk in the park, they couldn't speak much because of the sunlight falling on his computer screen. The buttons were not appearing. An hour later, we were ready to leave. I didn't know what to do. I would not kiss him or cry. I touched his shoulder and wheeled out into the summer evening. I looked back and I knew he was waving, though he wasn't. Watching him, an embodiment of my bravest self, the one I was moving towards, the one I was believed in for so many years alone, I knew that my journey was over for now. So an hour later, Mr. Kanga left, and he didn't know what to do, how to say goodbye, whether to kiss or cry. He just touched Mr. Hawkins' shoulder and then went out. And when Mr. Kanga looked back, he knew that Mr. Hawkins was waving towards him, although not practically. Mr. Kanga felt that watching Mr. Hawking was like embodiment of his own bravish self. He saw himself in Mr. Hawkins, the one he always wanted to be, the one he always wanted to believe in for so many years. And then Mr. Kanga knew that his journey was over, at least for now, and he was much inspired by meeting Mr. Hawkins. So we are, isn't it? Firdaus Kanga is the writer of this chapter. The Heaven on the Wheels was his book, in which he has written his journey throughout Britain, his experience. Now he stays in London only. This book is looking at Britain, seeing Britain through the eyes of Firdaus Kanga. Now children, I have written question answers here, which you can go through by pausing the video. I will stay at some time on each page so that you get time to pause and do the question answers. I hope this chapter was much inspiration for you as well. We always crib about the things that we don't have, but there are people around the world who do not have a lot of things. We are much luckier than them, so we should consider it. We should be happy with what we have, and we should always try to do better of it, isn't it? Thank you for listening to the chapter, students. Bye bye for